London, England, a major historical settlement for nearly 2 millennia, is home to millions of people, brilliant architecture, and countless iconic landmarks. It also plays a starring role in the Showtime original series The Tudors as the stomping grounds of a young Henry VIII. Showtime caught up with a Tudors expert for a tour of some of Henry's favorite sites.
Well, hello everybody. I want to welcome you to London and particularly to the Tudors tour. My name is Mark Conroy. I'm an official blue badge registered tourist guide here in the capital, and I'm a sort of expert on the Tudor period. We're going to explore Tudor London and show you some of the sites here in the capital that link to the Tudor period, particularly to King Henry VIII in his younger years. So many people have this impression that Henry VIII was a big, fat, old, grumpy man. And he was. But long before that, he was a young, fit, virile, athletic, energetic Renaissance man who loved music, he loved art, he loved sport. And we're going to take you to some of the places where he would have spent time in his younger years.
Let's go to the woods. Let's go for a hunt.
Yes. Yes!
Today we visit the town of Greenwich.
Here we are in Greenwich on the south side of the river. You're actually standing in the middle of the world. We're on the world's central meridian of 0 degrees here at Greenwich and the base of world time, GMT. And if we go back in time, the area ahead of you on the north side of the river is known as the Isle of Dogs. And Henry VIII would have known this area really well because that's where they kept the hunting dogs. And of course, hunting was something he loved. And it's also in this area that he established the famous Greenwich armouries to make suits of armour, which were not just designed as protection, but designed as fashion. And if you get to see some of his suits of armour, you'll notice that they are also decorated with what is called a codpiece. And that is a large cover to place around important locations as protection. But it wasn't just for protection. It was thought that the larger the endowment, the more fertile the man, a bigger chance of an heir to the throne.
I have a son!
He had one of the biggest endowments imaginable, and his codpiece would enter the room quite a while before him.
I always knew it wasn't my fault.
No. Further across the river, of course, you can see over there the Millennium Dome. That's the white building with the large yellow columns, which was actually built for the Millennium Exhibition back in 2000. And it's on that route towards the area called Woolwich. And that is where Henry VIII introduced his navy to this country, really.
She's the largest warship afloat, fires 91 guns, and has a company of 400 men.
So Henry VIII did spend time in this area, and of course it's here that he spent a lot of time in what was Placentia Palace, also known to some people as Pleasance Palace. It's on this site, in Placentia Palace, right here, that Henry VIII was born in the 1490s. And he then expanded that palace. And as we know, he expanded palaces all around London and all around England. By the end of his lifetime, the palace here covered something like 25 acres. And he also built a massive wooden banqueting hall. Now, that wooden banqueting hall had a bit of a problem connected to it because we're very near to the River Thames, of course, and the banqueting hall got a little bit damp and it started to subside. And that is why James I, in the very early 1600s, built this undercroft, a solid stone structure to support Henry VIII's banqueting house. So this was a great vantage point, and it gives you a great view looking down to the River Thames, which has always been a main highway and an area necessary to defend.
The town of Greenwich, one of young Henry VIII's many playgrounds.
Now, I can go play. My sister Margarita is to marry the King of Portugal. I want you to escort her and her dowry to Lisbon and give her away in my name.
Today, we visit the Tower of London.
We're heading north across the River Thames on one of the world's most famous bridges, Tower Bridge. Now, the River Thames was the main highway, particularly in the Middle Ages. In the time of King Henry VIII, he enjoyed travelling around London on his royal barges along the River Thames. You have to remember that a lot of the streets were just dirt tracks. Horse-drawn carriages could run into potholes in the ground, or you could be attacked by robbers on the streets. So if you had enough money, you'd probably travel by river.
Thomas.
Your Majesty.
If you look over to your left-hand side, you get a great view of the Tower of London. This fortress has been with us for around 900 years. It was actually built to put fear into the people of London and subdue the capital a little bit during the time of William the Conqueror. The fortress you're looking at today is made up of around 20 towers, and of course it's got the moat, and you can see that to your left-hand side right now. Now, Henry VIII didn't really enjoy the tower, and one of the reasons that his mother had died here, and his mother's brothers had actually been murdered at the Tower of London.
My uncle, murdered in cold blood.
This moat has been in use for defence initially, and it was filled with water. Nowadays, in the summer, this moat area is home to the Tower of London Music Festival. Today, we see an ice skating rink and a cafe. And that is very interesting because Henry VIII, as a young man, he was an athlete, he enjoyed sport, but he also loved music, and he was quite competitive.
Nothing stands in the way of me and my sport.
Are you sure?
Just watch and see what the King of England can do.
If ice skating had been possible at the Tower in his day, I'm sure he would have been the best at that sport, and everybody else would have made sure that he came first. Well, it looks like I've been sent to the Tower. I'm here at the Tower of London with Sally Dixon-Smith and Jane Spooner, who are both curators here at the Tower. So please tell me about Traitors' Gate.
The Tower of London was not designed as a prison, it was designed as a fortress. But because it was so strong, that's why prisoners were kept here. Traitors' Gate is where prisoners would have arrived at the Tower of London before being brought here to who knows what end. It's actually part of a 13th century water gate at the Tower of London called St Thomas's Tower. But the wooden gate itself is what most people associate with Traitors' Gate.
So how much of this building is actually Tudor then?
Well, if you look at the timber work, that was actually work commissioned from James Needham, who was Henry VIII's master carpenter. His work was part of the Great Refurbishment in 1532, prior to Anne Boleyn's coronation.
And who were some of those people who came through that gateway?
Well, Sir Thomas More was one of them,
Yeah.
and of course Anne Boleyn was another.
Yes.
Many people who came to the Tower by boat would have arrived at Traitors' Gate, and certainly the King, when he arrived in state, would also have come in through Traitors' Gate.
And I've heard lots of crowing noises. Tell me about that.
Oh yes, you've heard our friendly ravens, and they're here, as the myth goes, to prevent the monarchy from falling.
What's left over architecturally from Henry VIII's reign in this part of the tower?
There is the chapel of St Peter Adventular. If we look behind me at the Queen's House, that dates from 1540. That was built with funds released by Thomas Cromwell.
This is Thomas Cromwell. I think it'd be very useful for your Majesty.
Mr. Cromwell, Your Majesty.
Now, in this area, I believe there used to be part of the Tudor palace that Henry VIII lived in.
It's probably quite hard to believe at the moment. We're standing in the middle of a bare lawn. If you look between the Lanthorn Tower and the ruins of the 12th century Wardrobe Tower, you've got to try and imagine, spanning the gap, there would have been a magnificent Tudor palace. In 1532, a major refurbishment took place in the royal palace. It would have looked very grand. They were decorated with classical motifs known as antique work, and this is really quite elaborate.
It would have been quite spectacular, and the coronation traditionally left from the tower, and it would have processed right from here to Westminster Abbey. There's an irony that so much work was done here in preparation for her coronation, and yet 3 years later, when she's brought back under arrest, it's these rooms in which she's kept.
I have yet to decide whether to make your bedmate a head shorter.
Great hall where great feasts had happened surrounding her coronation, where she'd knighted Knights of the Bath, was where her trial was held. Well, she was executed here on Tower Green. She'd been arrested on the 2nd of May and she was executed on the 19th, so it's very fast.
What about the execution site in general? Where was that?
In the Tudor period, Tower Green actually meant much of the grassed area in between the buildings, and whenever an execution was ordered inside the tower, a scaffolding was built afresh wherever was convenient.
And she's actually buried right near the side of the execution.
That's
is that
right. She's buried in the chapel of St Peter Adventular.
Just here,
And
right.
ironically, this chapel was built very early on in Henry's reign.
So I believe the execution site has been marked now by a new monument.
The monument was unveiled last year, and we wanted to commemorate the site where people were executed in a more appropriate way, really.
Well, Jane and Sally, I want to thank you so much for giving us all this information on the Tudor period. Thank you. Lovely to meet you.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much.
The Tower of London, one of history's greatest villains.
You see what kind of monster I am?
Today, we visit Crosby Hall and the Apothecaries' Hall.
Coming up on your right-hand side, you're about to see the statue of Sir Thomas More, one of Henry VIII's very important political advisors, who unfortunately fell from favour.
Are you not frightened, Papa?
Death? No. I have given myself entirely into the hands of God.
Two of Henry VIII's political advisors were very famous. One was Cardinal Wolsey, who was basically a corrupt man and eventually fell from power due to being corrupt. The other was Sir Thomas More, a very close advisor to Henry VIII, who probably fell from power because he was just too conscientious.
Some people think they ought to go to heaven in feather beds, but that is not the way. Our Lord himself went there in pain and tribulation. Not that I'm suggesting that you're like that. Of course.
During his lifetime, as a pious man, he didn't believe he was capable of celibacy, so he actually got married twice. And Sir Thomas More, unfortunately, ultimately fell from favour because he was a man of conscience. He found it very difficult to accept that Henry VIII was above the Pope, and this led to his own downfall, and ultimately he was beheaded. His head was placed on the Tower Bridge next to the Tower of London for about a month until his sister actually took it down. And very close by, just over to your left-hand side, is Crosby Hall. And although that house wasn't originally at that location, it was the house that Sir Thomas More lived in. We're standing next to Crosby Hall, which is the home of a wealthy merchant. And although it's right here now, it used to be in the City of London, at Bishopsgate. And back in the Middle Ages, Shakespeare knew of the building. In fact, he actually set scenes of Richard III doing his plotting in the building. But it was moved here brick by brick around 1910. And what's nice about this being here today is that this land was actually an orchard owned by Sir Thomas More in the Middle Ages. So in some ways it's come back to its natural place. But when it was in Bishopsgate, it was the home of Sir Thomas More, the man, according to Erasmus, who was more pure than any snow.
It's very good. Strongly worded, but it's very good.
If there is anything true and good in it, it is due to you. I could never have written it, or anything else, Sir Thomas, without your guidance and unfailing honesty.
And next stop is Blackfriars. Please follow me, everybody. I'll take you right through to the Apothecaries' Hall, which is part of one of the livery companies in London here today. But it's on this site that there used to be the Dominican Priory, the home of the Blackfriars monks. And Henry VIII was involved in the dissolution of the monasteries. He closed down the monasteries during the time that he decided to divorce Catherine of Aragon. And just across the Fleet River, which doesn't really exist anymore, Henry VIII lived in the Bridewell Palace. They staged a big diplomatic event when Charles V came over here to form an alliance with Henry against France.
Together, we shall be invincible.
With you beside me, there is no boundary or frontier or world we could not conquer.
For that event, Henry built a huge passageway from his Bridewell Palace across here to the monastery, to the priory. There was a guest house here, and this is where Charles stayed. And the term Blackfriars has been used for many things. The area is known as Blackfriars, and on top of that, the monks were called Blackfriars. On this site, we did have a couple of theatres, and that's quite interesting because Shakespeare would have performed in this area. If you have a look just here to the wall, you see this painting. It's quite interesting. It's Catherine of Aragon speaking to Cardinal Wolsey. And that's because on this site, the divorce trial for Catherine of Aragon and King Henry VIII actually took place. And linking it to the theatre, more than 100 years later, Shakespeare reenacted that trial in his play, King Henry VIII, and it was actually performed here on this same site where the trial actually took place. So this has been the site of a royal divorce, a site of a reenactment during the time of Shakespeare, and now we're in a spectacular building called the Apothecaries' Hall, which stands on the site of all that Tudor architecture.
Crosby Hall and the Apothecaries' Hall, two extraordinary religious remnants from the time of Henry VIII.
I ask for one thing and one thing only. Justice.
Thomas, let me give you a little advice. If you want to keep the love of a prince, you must be prepared to give him the thing you most care for in all the world. Today, we visit Hampton Court Palace.
You now have a fantastic view straight across the River Thames to Hampton Court Palace. This immense palace was originally built as the private home of Cardinal Wolsey. Now, Cardinal Wolsey amassed a huge fortune, lots of money, lots of homes, and Henry VIII was jealous.
Your Eminence has built the most beautiful palace, probably the finest house in England. I have nothing to compare with it, nothing to show more fair.
It is yours.
And Henry said, thanks very much, I'll have them. And that became Hampton Court Palace. I'm at Hampton Court Palace with Brett Dolman, who's one of the curators here. Brett, tell me, this is the side of the tilt yard, I believe, is that right?
All this part of the grounds of the Tudor Palace, from what's behind me, the palace stretching off into the direction behind you, were the sporting grounds. This was where Henry VIII, as a young man, disported himself. You have to imagine crowds of the courts, get rid of all the walls, big open space, towers to provide the best viewing points, terraced seating and things like that around the areas where things like jousting took place. It's a violent sport, and injuries did happen. Henry himself was injured at some point in his career.
He was quite a fit man. I believe I read somewhere he wore out about 4 or 5 horses every day.
Yes, I think that's true. He was definitely a very fit man. He was a very energetic man. He was trim. He wasn't fat.
And what other sports did he play?
Henry played all manner of sports. Things like hunting. Hunting, virtually anything, was considered a royal sport as well. But also tennis.
This is the real tennis court here at Hampton Court Palace. What do we know about real tennis?
Well, this was a game that Henry VIII played. This is on the site of Henry VIII's tennis courts as well. He played this form of royal or real tennis, which is involving playing indoors, hitting the ball off walls, and there's a different sort of point structure to the game too.
40-30, chase to 4, gentlemen. Ball.
I've got a real tennis racket and ball here. How does it differ from the ordinary game of tennis?
Well, you can see that they're made of different substances. The shape of the racket is different. The history of real tennis, as I understand it, emerges from a handball game, and the racket is introduced pretty much in the shape of a hand to start with, which enables you to hit the ball faster.
His Majesty the King!
We're in the Great Watching Chamber, so I suppose the first question is, what is the Great Watching Chamber?
This is Henry VIII's Great Watching Chamber, built in the 1530s, where the yeomen of the guard watched after the king, carrying large two-handed battle axes, lining the walls, making sure that nobody that wasn't desired came through those doors, which are the doors to the private apartments of the king.
Your Majesty! Rome has been sacked!
Let him through! This is on the footprint of Cardinal Wolsey's Great Watching Chamber. He had as magnificent a chamber as Henry did before Henry took the palace over from him. Even when this was Wolsey's palace, it still was technically the king's. The king had the right to take over any of his courtiers' lodgings should he so desire.
With the furnishings?
And so the furnishings we see and the tapestries, they would have all been here at that time?
They would have been, or similar things like them. He inherited Wolsey's tapestry collection as much as he did the palace.
Looking at the ceiling, which is quite spectacular.
This is the Tudor ceiling. So a lot of this has been replaced. What you've got here is you've got portcullises, the Tudor rose, the French fleur-de-lis. These are all heraldic devices that speak to Henry's past, his dynastic heritage, how he had the right to be king, which was an important point for him to make. He had ended decades of civil war in this country. If you look over in the far corner, you can see 3 of these emblematic roundels, which are made of leather mache. They're the 3 originals left on the ceiling. Henry VIII was keen that his dynasty would continue, which is why Henry VIII's reign is always characterised by this desperate search for an heir, and his marriage to Catherine eventually flounders on her inability to provide him with a legitimate male son.
And would Henry have ever actually dined in this room?
Probably not. This is a room which would have fed the higher-ranking members of the court. Most of the court would have eaten in the Great Hall, where they were allowed to have 2 meals a day, up to maybe 300, 400 people there.
God be with all of you, and remember your duties. Let us pray.
You can certainly see why this is called the Great Hall. What happened in this room?
Well, this is Henry VIII's Great Hall from 1530s again. The way it looks today is pretty much the way it looked in the 1530s. The roof would have been more colourful. The tapestries that you see here today are Henry VIII's. They're part of the most important set of tapestries that he owned, which is the story of Abraham. Cardinal Wolsey had thousands of tapestries. The Venetian ambassador tells us that he changed them on a weekly basis, which is a grand statement of cultural ownership as much as anything else. This is both the place where you had some of the grandest entertainment of the era, huge court masques, dances, banquets, that sort of thing. But also, on a daily basis, this is a works canteen for the 600 or so people of Henry's court. If you think of a sort of a medieval Lord of the Manor type setup, you've got a raised platform at one end where the king and his council would originally have eaten, but by this point they're retreating into their private apartments. They're getting further away from the daily business of dealing with an ever-expanding court. And at this end of the room, that's the public end. This is where the court would have come in, all of the lower-ranking servants that were allowed to eat in here. You have to imagine this place, therefore, being really, really loud and noisy.
To my son!
Brett, these were Wolsey's private rooms, were this where he actually lived?
This is Cardinal Wolsey's private apartments, where he lived, where he studied, where he slept. These are the more private, intimate spaces. As we progress through, you'll get more and more public spaces where he would have entertained, where he would have had private dinners.
This panelling is amazing. Is that what is the design on here?
Well, this is linenfold panelling. It's this typical Tudor interior design. This has a particularly sort of special twist to it. It is something which Wolsey perhaps was involved in designing or working with the designers for. It has a little cross that sort of speaks volumes for his
religious connection.
Career.
And the next room would have been used for more formal events, would it? Or?
Yes, and then you have a sequence of rooms which would have been used for entertaining. These were for where Wolsey met a particular ambassador, where he made the decisions which affected his career and Henry's career. Henry, at the start of his reign, is interested seemingly in two things: in going to war with France.
I believe these are all just causes for war!
Yes. And somebody that's able also to take some of the more detailed business of administration away from him. And Wolsey's career is made like that because Henry is busy doing all the things that he wants to do as a young 20-something king.
And was that part of Wolsey's sort of personality? Was it his plan to get...
He's absolutely tremendously ambitious. There's plenty of letters between them that show that they trusted each other, that Henry knew what he was letting Wolsey get away with, and Wolsey also knew how far he could push things. You know, Henry was happy in a way to let somebody like Wolsey build up the career that he did at somewhere as magnificent as Hampton Court. He's referred to as this other king by people that come to do deals with the court. Henry comes to unravel when you have this terrible dynastic problem that, despite many pregnancies, Catherine has not produced a male heir for Henry VIII. He needs to look elsewhere.
I want a divorce, and you will get one for me.
He finds somebody that he becomes infatuated with in Anne Boleyn, and Wolsey singularly fails to pull off the most important political event of his life, which is the divorce from Catherine of Aragon.
You have destroyed me.
Hampton Court Palace, a surviving stage for history's oldest dramas.
Have you any idea of the cost of this production?
Okay, everybody, well, we're coming to the end of our Tudors tour here in London, but I'd like you to think of one thing. I'd like you to think of Elvis Presley. You might think that's strange, but think about Elvis. In his later years, he was a very big, overweight, grumpy old man. But in his youth, he was young and fit. And that's the Henry VIII I want you to remember. Although he was old and fat in his later years, in his youth, he was a rock star. He was young, athletic, a musician, a scholar, a Renaissance man. So that's the memory I want you to take home. I want to thank you for coming today, and I look forward to seeing you next time you're here in London. Bye-bye, everybody.